On July 17, 1981, inside the Hyatt Regency Hotel in Kansas City, Missouri, hundreds of guests gathered for a Friday night tea dance. The hotel's atrium was alive with music and chatter as people filled the floor and leaned over the suspended walkways above. At 7:05 p.m., in just a few terrifying seconds, those walkways collapsed, crashing down onto the crowd below. 114 people were killed. More than 200 were injured. It remains one of the deadliest structural failures in American history. The Hyatt Regency Hotel in Kansas City was one of the city's most ambitious projects of the late 1970s. Construction began in 1978, and the grand opening took place in July 1980. At the time, Kansas City was eager to modernize its downtown image, and the Hyatt was marketed as a symbol of progress and luxury. The building stood tall with more than 40 stories, offering a striking glass atrium that rose through the lower levels. This atrium was not just an architectural flourish. It was designed to be the hotel's social heart, a place where gatherings, parties, and special events would take place under a canopy of glass and steel. One of the most eye-catching features of this atrium was its series of suspended walkways. These steel and concrete bridges crossed the open space, connecting rooms and ballrooms on the upper floors. They allowed guests to look down into the atrium or simply pass from one side of the hotel to the other without having to descend to the ground floor. The walkways quickly became a symbol of the hotel itself. They appeared in advertisements, brochures, and press photos as proof of modern design and engineering confidence. From the beginning, the Hyatt Regency positioned itself as a premier destination. The hotel hosted conventions, corporate events, weddings, and community gatherings. Friday evening tea dances, featuring live bands and dancing in the atrium, became especially popular with local residents. By 1981, these events routinely drew hundreds of guests, ranging from business travelers to retirees looking for a night out. For many, the Hyatt was the place to be seen in Kansas City. But even as the Hyatt enjoyed its reputation as a jewel of the city, there were troubling signs beneath the surface. During construction, the project had already faced significant setbacks. In October 1979, before the hotel even opened, a section of the atrium roof collapsed, killing one worker and injuring others. This incident raised concerns about the building's design and construction methods, though the project continued after adjustments were made. Despite this earlier tragedy, the hotel was promoted as both safe and state-of-the-art. By the summer of 1981, the Hyatt Regency was just 1 year old. Its walkways, still gleaming and frequently used by guests, stood as a showcase of architectural ambition. On July 17th, when the atrium filled with more than 1,500 people for the Friday dance, no one could have imagined that the very feature that symbolized the hotel's elegance would soon become the cause of America's deadliest structural collapse. On the evening of July 17, 1981, the Hyatt Regency's atrium was alive with sound. More than 1,500 people filled the space for the weekly Friday night tea dance. A live band played from a stage setup at one end of the room, while couples twirled and moved across the dance floor below. The atrium was crowded, but it was also festive. Families, tourists, and locals mingled together. Some people came to dance, while others gathered to watch from above. Many of those who did not want to join the crowd below instead leaned against the railings of the suspended walkways on the second and fourth floors. From those bridges, they could look down and enjoy the music, the lights, and the energy of the night. At approximately 7 p.m., the atmosphere was at its peak. The music played loudly, conversations overlapped, and the walkways were filled with onlookers. On the second-floor walkway, dozens of guests clustered near the center, pointing down at the dancers and waving to friends. Directly above them, on the fourth floor, even more people gathered along the edges, pressing forward for a better view. Only a few minutes later, things began to change. Witnesses would later recall hearing sharp popping sounds, like metal under strain. Some described it as a loud crack, while others thought it was part of the music or the band's equipment. In reality, the steel connections holding the walkways in place were beginning to give way under the enormous load of people standing on them. At 7:05 p.m., without any warning, the fourth-floor walkway dropped from its supports. The massive structure, made of concrete and steel, plunged directly onto the second-floor walkway below it. The second walkway could not withstand the sudden impact. Within a fraction of a second, both bridges collapsed together, crashing down into the crowded atrium. The sound was deafening. Survivors described it as a roar, a mix of twisting metal, shattering glass, and the screams of hundreds of people. Dust and debris filled the air as the walkways, each weighing more than 60 tons, landed on those standing below. The collapse took only a second, but its consequences were instant and catastrophic. Chaos erupted inside the atrium. The band stopped playing as the floor was engulfed in wreckage. People nearest to the stage were thrown backward by the force of falling debris. Those who survived described stumbling through thick dust, choking as they tried to make sense of what had just happened. Others who had been standing beneath the walkways were trapped instantly, pinned by slabs of concrete and twisted steel. Rescue attempts began almost immediately. Guests who had not been injured rushed forward to try to lift debris or pull survivors free. Some used their bare hands, while others tried to shift smaller pieces of concrete. But the scale of destruction was overwhelming. Many victims were trapped under tons of rubble, crushed beyond recognition. Survivors recalled hearing voices calling out for help, some faint and some desperate, echoing from beneath the collapsed walkways. Emergency responders arrived within minutes. Firefighters, paramedics, and police rushed into the atrium, but the scene was one of total devastation. The atrium floor was a maze of twisted metal beams and broken glass. Injured victims lay across the floor, some barely moving, others crying out in pain. For rescuers, it was difficult even to know where to begin. As firefighters worked to stabilize the wreckage, more survivors were pulled out. Some were covered in blood and dust, others carried with broken bones or crushed limbs. Many were in shock, unable to understand what had just happened. Still, the voices of the trapped could be heard. Rescuers crawled through tight spaces, trying to reach those pinned beneath massive slabs. The weight of the debris made it nearly impossible to move without specialized equipment. By this point, the atrium was filled with chaos and confusion. Outside, ambulances lined up as victims were carried out one by one. Hospitals in Kansas City quickly became overwhelmed as stretchers arrived continuously throughout the night. Inside the hotel, rescuers used jacks, hydraulic lifts, and chainsaws to cut through steel. The work was slow and dangerous. Every move risked shifting the wreckage and injuring those still alive underneath. Through the night, the rescue continued. Volunteers, hotel staff, and even bystanders joined in. Doctors and nurses crawled into the rubble to provide medical care on the spot, inserting IV lines and giving oxygen to those who could not be moved. Firefighters worked for hours under the risk of further collapse, determined to save as many as they could. Some stories from that night would remain etched in memory. One survivor, trapped under the walkway, recalled being pinned so tightly that he could barely breathe. He listened to the cries of others fade away as the hours passed. Another victim, still conscious, asked rescuers to stay with him, speaking softly until he could no longer respond. For many trapped beneath the tons of steel and concrete, time simply ran out before help could reach them. By the early morning hours of July 18th, nearly all survivors who could be reached had been rescued. What remained under the wreckage were bodies, dozens of them, crushed beyond recognition, their personal belongings scattered across the atrium floor. The festive dance had turned into a disaster scene. Music sheets from the band lay among the rubble, mixed with shoes, purses, and broken glass. In total, 114 people died as a result of the collapse, and more than 200 others were injured. What had started as a night of dancing and celebration became one of the deadliest structural failures in the United States history. The collapse of the Hyatt Regency Walkways was sudden, merciless, and unforgettable, leaving behind a scene of destruction that survivors and rescuers would never forget.
In the immediate aftermath of the collapse, Kansas City was plunged into shock. The Hyatt Regency Hotel, once a symbol of modern progress, became synonymous with tragedy. By the morning of July 18th, the official death toll had risen to 114, making it the deadliest structural collapse in American history at that time. More than 200 others were hospitalized, many with severe injuries that would leave permanent scars and disabilities. Hospitals across the city struggled to keep up, and families crowded emergency rooms and hallways searching for missing loved ones. The scene inside the atrium was described as nightmarish. Rescue workers later recalled the silence that followed after the last survivors had been pulled out. Bodies lay beneath blankets, while personal items, shoes, watches, glasses, were scattered across the wreckage. For many Kansas City residents, the hotel that had once been a glamorous landmark was now a site of mourning. Attention quickly turned to the question of why the walkways failed. The National Bureau of Standards, along with local investigators, launched a formal inquiry. What they uncovered revealed a devastating story of engineering failure. Originally, the walkways had been designed to hang in a continuous line from the ceiling supports, but during construction, the design was changed. Instead of one long rod supporting both walkways, the builders installed two separate sets of rods, one supporting the fourth-floor walkway and another set attaching it directly to the second-floor bridge below. This modification, seemingly small, effectively doubled the load on the fourth-floor connections. When dozens of people gathered on the walkways on July 17th, the weight became too much. The steel connections tore apart and the entire structure gave way. Investigators later concluded that the design change had reduced the safety margin of the walkways to almost nothing. The collapse had not been caused by an earthquake, a storm, or sabotage, but by a fatal engineering flaw that had gone unnoticed. The consequences for those responsible were severe. The engineering firm Gillum Colaco lost its licenses in multiple states. Lawsuits followed, and victims' families were awarded millions of dollars in damages. The Hyatt Hotel Corporation faced immense criticism, although the company eventually reached settlements. The tragedy also prompted widespread reforms in building codes and inspection standards across the United States. Engineers, architects, and contractors were reminded in the harshest possible way of the importance of safety over convenience. For Kansas City, the memory of that night never faded. Survivors carried the physical and emotional scars for the rest of their lives. Annual memorials were established, and the disaster became a defining chapter in the city's history. What had begun as an evening of music and dancing ended as a permanent lesson in the consequences of structural failure. The Hyatt Regency collapse was no accident of chance. It was the direct result of human error,
a reminder that even the most celebrated designs can carry deadly flaws.